Hello and welcome to Access Chat. I'm delighted that on IDPD we're recording this interview with Kathy Martinez. Both Debra and I are members of the WID board, and Kathy was also at WID for a very long time, and it has a long and glorious history in disability inclusion. So rather than me give out Kathy's CV, Kathy, would you, well, firstly, welcome. Would you care to tell us about yourself and how you came to be working in the field?
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to be a guest on the show. I've been a fan of the show for a long time, and it's great to meet you all and have a conversation. So how did I become part of the disability rights movement? Wow, that's I'm pretty old, so it's been a while since I've been active. I guess of course, it has to do with my childhood. I was born blind. I come from a very large Latino family. There's 6 kids all told, and 2 of us happen to be blind. And as of now, there's no known reason or cure. So Peggy is my sister. She's a year younger than me, or 2 years younger than me. We are the 2 middle kids of 6. So as a child, as a blind child, I was expected to participate in family activities like doing chores and being a part of games. I had also a very large extended family, so I got lots of input from various cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents. My parents are originally from New Mexico, so I was able to experience what it's like to live in a rural setting. I spent many summers in New Mexico riding horses and learning how to bale hay and pitch hay. And I think I wanted to be a cowboy. And then I grew out of that phase, but I'm still fascinated by sort of the rural life. My parents lived in Southern California when I was growing up, and we lived near strawberry fields. And I remember as a kid hearing disputes between the workers and the growers about what, like in those days, in the 1960s and early 70s, people would weigh their fruit and then get paid immediately. And I would hear these disputes and I would be like, God, why are they, there's always arguments at the weigh stations. And so I ended up getting involved in the United Farm Workers Youth Group. But they did not know what to do with a blind person. They really didn't. They were kind of tickled in a way, or that in a very patronizing way, that I would be interested in this issue. But I would attend meetings, and I would often be asked to do phone calls since I could talk and somebody could read me a phone number. And I could braille it up in my old Perkins Brailler and then, make calls. But I learned a lot about organizing and, a lot about oppression that wasn't my oppression. It wasn't about blindness. So I learned a lot about the world as a teenager. It was in kind of the late 60s, early 70s. And with the women's movement, the LGBTQ movement was getting started. I was part of both of those movements. And finally, I found in the mid to late 70s, found the disability rights movement. And when I found it, I moved up to the Bay Area. There was a protest in 1977 at the Federal Building. I got an invite in Braille, and I went. I did not go in the building. I will be very clear. I was at the 504 sit-in, but I did not go in the building because at the time I was at a school for the blind here in the Bay Area. And basically they knew I was going to go to the protest, and they said, if you get stuck in the building, you're going to be kicked out of the school. So I was very careful, but that was really, that opened my eyes to, the fact that there was such a thing as disability pride. And at that point in time, we had a lot of support. The people with disabilities had taken over the federal building in San Francisco to protest the fact that the 504 regulations weren't signed. I know this is a very US-centric event, but it did spur many great things. So after that, I was in a relationship. I lived in Mexico, so I really got to, feel what it was like living in a developing country. My partner and I adopted our son there, and we moved back. And that's really when I started getting really involved in the disability rights movement. My passion has always been economic empowerment. My work with various chambers of commerce in the US, the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, the Lesbian and Gay Chamber of Commerce. I was fortunate to have some consultancies with the ILO, where I spent quite a bit of time in Africa. And then I went on to work for the World Institute on Disability. Excuse me, guys. I know that is obnoxious for a recording. I worked for the World Institute on Disability for about 16 years, where I primarily did international development work, and was able, we had very big grants with Russia, Uzbekistan, and a few very interesting grants with Honduras and El Salvador right after the civil war in El Salvador. So we worked with disabled veterans on both sides of the war. As I said, my passion has been economic empowerment, because I believe that if we don't have access to resources, we won't have power in this country, given that we're a capitalist force here in the US, whether we like it or not. So during my international work and after, I focused on economic justice for people with disabilities, which meant starting numerous projects, including a project for Latinos with disabilities that was completely focused on work and how do people who are Latinx or Latino, depending on the generation you're from, how does our culture influence how we matriculate through the disability service delivery system? So, does the fact that we're disabled and don't speak English? Yes, that does have an impact. What about our fellow Latino brothers and sisters? Are they hiring us? So these are questions that I asked in like 2000. The project went from like 2003 to 2007, or actually 2003 to 2009. So, and we made some headway. It definitely influenced the work I would do next in my next career iteration at the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, where I had a project called Add Us In, working with lots of different minority chamber of commerce in this country, African-American women, LGBTQ, and Latino and Asian chambers of commerce. And, my goal really was to connect people of color with, the establishments that are run by people of color with those of us with disabilities. And the message is, hey, many of us people with disabilities are people of color. We're not all white, and our cultures influence how disability is, how we handle and how we deal with disability. So, since from the U.S. Department of Labor, I decided that we had passed. President Obama established an executive order which really mandated that our federal contractors recruit and hire people with disabilities, and we so we established that executive order, which strengthened some regulations that that kind of forced federal contractors to be more intentional about hiring people with disabilities. So I thought, if I'm recommending that people go into the private sector, I should consider doing that. I felt like I had done. I said I could, I could. Sorry, I'm being distracted by the chat. I thought, well, I've done what I could do here at ODEP, and it's time to move on, which I believe as disability leaders, it's our role, it's our job to move on, to give new people, to make way for new blood, new ideas. And so I took a job with Wells Fargo as the lead for disability and accessibility strategy. And I was there for 6 years. It was one of the best experiences of my life because it was the first time, honestly, that I had, since I worked with the farm worker group, that I'd worked out of the disability bubble. Even though I was the lead for the disability work, the first year was really like drinking through a fire hose because I had never worked where people didn't understand accommodations. I'd never really worked, in my adult life where people hadn't worked on a team with a person with a disability. So it was one of the best experiences of my life because I really went in cold, knowing very little, I will admit, about financial services too. But there was a willingness on the part of Wells Fargo. There was a desire to weave disability into our diversity work at the time. And so I thought we were very successful. I currently am now leading a nonprofit disability law firm. I will admit to not being a lawyer. I am definitely a second-class citizen in that regard. But I'm loving the work. I work for the disability rights. I work for a group called Disability Rights Advocates. As I said, we are a nonprofit disability law firm, which we do high impact litigation, meaning class action lawsuits that have a very large impact to change systems, policies, practices for people with disabilities. So we've sued the MTA at the New York City subway to make it more accessible. We've sued school districts so that disabled kids can get free lunch, which they weren't getting because they were segregated. So the work that we do is high impact litigation. And I've been at Disability Rights Advocates for about 9 months now. And here I am.
Wow, that's quite the story. And of course, I know your work. Her name really is the Honorable Kathy Martinez because she was confirmed by our Senate and Congress. So she mentioned that she worked for the Office of Disability Employment Policy, which is part of our Department of Labor, but she didn't mention that is the highest ranking position a person with a disability can hold in the United States government. So I think she downplayed a little bit what she has brought to our community. It is so powerful. She is just a legend, and very proud to work with her and also work with her sister Peggy. Peggy and I work together. So she's very, very smart people. But it really was a very powerful position that you held at ODEP. But one thing I love that what you've done, Kathy, is like you've tried, advocacy from so many different viewpoints. And I remember when you were at the Department of Labor, you had said to me, I think I'm going to, my next job, I'm going to go and work with a big corporation because you're experiencing all the different nuances of working with those different groups. Because I know often, for example, as a vendor, I'm a vendor. So we don't always understand, for example, what Neil has to deal with when he's trying to guide ATOS forward with all of the accessibility and disability inclusion. There's so many moving parts. And so I just love that your background has taken you to all these different, places. And now, of course, you're working with the law firm, with lawyers. And I agree with what you're saying. Sometimes thank goodness we can litigate and we can sue the heck out of these people. And I love that, recently, we're seeing, more of these corporations want to work with our community, but it's a pretty big deal what's happening. I feel like there's a lot unfolding right now, but I loved the work that you've done with being a Latino American, and so I think the intersections are so important. Why, Kathy, why did you know that you had to address them from those lenses? Because I know that we're really proud at Billion Strong that you're a special advisor to the board of directors, and Neil is on the board of directors. So love that you're doing that. But I just am so amazed with your work, Kathy. And I know you explained a little bit of it, but what do you recommend to the younger people that are trying to figure out where do they go? Especially, like you said, you wanted to be a cowboy when you were growing up. So, okay, so is that reasonable for me to be a cowboy when I'm a woman? And
I was never a boy. I will say
and I'm
I've
right.
never been a boy.
Right. And so maybe it is reasonable, but but I also want to make one more comment, that another thing that I love about your leadership, and you mentioned it briefly, is that you will not stay at a position for very long, because you want to give younger people with disabilities an opportunity. And I know you and I have talked about this, and that you're like, no, I knew that Jennifer was ready. So, I was leaving. I knew that there are these talented individuals. And so you and I are the same age. Do we have some kind of obligation to present a legacy for the younger leaders with disabilities that are, coming up?
Well, you asked about 4 questions.
I know I did. I'm sorry. I had coffee this morning.
So first I'll say yes, I believe, and I have felt that our leaders have stayed in positions for way too long in many cases, because the world is changing, and we're not always going to be the young 25-year-olds that we were. The world was a very different. I'm 63 years old, and the world was very different when I was 25, rather than what it is now. So I believe we have an obligation. I believe there's enough work for everybody. There is plenty of work to bring disability to an equitable place in the society. So yes, I believe it is my duty as an older leader to make room, to get out of the way. And there's plenty of work for me to do as somebody, with my experience. Now, to answer your question about the Latino culture and disability, what I had been working in the international arena for about 20 years, and in 2000, I just thought, wow, here I am, I'm going outside of the country, and it was a great experience. Believe me, I learned how to listen. I think I really did learn how to listen. I hope I learned how to not be an obnoxious American to, tell everybody what to do and how we did it, because that is not their experience. So, I know I got so much out of it, but one day I remember flying in, I don't remember where, from probably Spain or Russia, because those were some of our last contracts that I worked on. And, I realized, like, oh, there's so many Latinos here in this country who are not connected to the disability service delivery system, who don't have access to the rehab systems, and don't know about independent living and what that means, the concept of self-determination. And Judy Heumann and I had a conversation about it, and fortunately she was still the assistant secretary at OSERS, the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services in the Department of Education in the US. and we came up, it wasn't just me and her. I mean, there was a lot of people having this conversation that we should really focus on people of color, and how culture impacts people's view of disability, and how the intersectionality of race, ethnicity, and disability really does impact someone's trajectory and opportunities. So she was genius enough to create some grants, and WID applied for them, and we got it. And we started our project called Proyecto Visión. And it had nothing to do with me being blind. It had to do with the fact that, we saw a vision for the future of Latinx folks becoming woven into our movement. And I think that, the younger folks definitely have picked up on that. They've taken it to a new level through all the disability justice work. And I think it's critical, but we have to remember culture plays a huge role in how disability is perceived. And while the disability rights movement in the US was really based on kind of middle-class values, you know, I was one of the few leaders that was not white and came from a very different place. And so, you know, I came from, you know, my parents were both very working class, and, you know, their English wasn't great when I was a child. And I experienced things, you know, that resulted from their lived experience. Like if people couldn't understand my mom, they would you know, yell at her. They would speak louder to her. I mean, is that going to help? No. You know, I thought very often she was disrespected in the disability community when I was younger because she wasn't white. I mean, there was a lot of reasons why I felt it's really critical for our movement to weave culture in as, you know, an aspect, a dimension of our, you know, of who we are as a disability rights movement. And I think, you know, I think the world is doing a great job of that. People are seeing that we are everyone. We're not just a you know, an island of white middle class folks, you know, in the US.
Katie, I was about to ask you a question, and then your last words have maybe change what I was going to ask. You know, I went in a completely different direction because you mentioned something very important that's related with culture. And sometimes we often see organizations, and this I need to make a critic here in the United States, who are enabling, you know, improving accessibility and creating spaces for the disability community in other countries, and they want to almost tell the others, here is our roadmap, and you just have to follow it, without asking the others, maybe we can learn something from you and bring it to our roadmap. How do looking to your career and your experience, how should organizations approach in order to enabling these communities across different geographies?
Well, first of all, one of the things I did the most in my international development years was tear up the plan when we got to the country, because it was pointless. I remember going to Siberia and working with women. It was a group called Ariadna in Siberia. And I went with somebody who's a brilliant media person, and you know, we'd asked him, what do you want to learn? What do you want to learn? And we had this giant plan. Okay, you know, we had a week. So today we're going to do this. Tomorrow we're going to do this. When I got there, I just realized I almost said a bad word. This is baloney. This is not based in their experience. It is completely separate from their reality. And in a way, as much as I think, you know, international trips to the US are important, I think, you know, it gives somebody a different perspective. But if you're going to bring disabled women here, it's great, you know, that they get to learn about what's happening in the world and see the US. But in my mind, or disabled people, I should say, bring somebody from the government, bring somebody from other NGOs, because when they go back to the country, they're alone with their power, the new power in their minds, but then they go back to the same place that's inaccessible. People have very low expectations of them. So I really would like to see more international programs where if we're going to raise the boat of disability, we don't just bring a bunch of, you know, wonderful disabled people to this country, show them what we've done. I mean, I think that's part of it. I think but it's not all of it. When I was in Namibia, I was there for about I think about 6 weeks. And one of the things I learned, I was there to work with their women's office to to help bring disabled women, the issues of disabled women into the planning of that office, because the war had just been, the war had just ended, and there were many disabled women in SWAPO in the early 90s. So when we got there, it's not our job. The best thing I did was bring everybody together and let them talk to each other and stay the hell out of the way. I mean, of course I could give advice, right? But my job was to be a convener and a catalyst for conversation. Because what happens, as you know, is when international aid leaves, things just, tend to fall apart. So I believe, that in Namibia, I feel like that was one of my most successful international consultancies. We left with people speaking, the Namibian women speaking to each other. The disabled Namibian women knew how to contact the women in the president's office. They knew how to contact the press. They knew how to contact other disabled men. So I believe that our job, we have to assess the situation. We have to listen to people where they're at. I can tell you many stories of when I really, realized I'm an idiot. Our program is completely wrong. And that's a whole other conversation.
But that's great. We wholeheartedly agree with your assessment. Not the one that you're an idiot, by the way. The other one, which is that we need to actually learn from other cultures.
Oh my God.
And that we can't assume that the context within which we're operating in our privileged techno-literate Western democracies will work in the context of someone in sub-Saharan Africa or in rural India or in parts of Latin America. So at the same time, we can learn from them because they are dealing with the challenges that they face and innovating. So we've taken a really keen interest in Access Chat over the years of trying to find people that are doing things in countries outside of the Anglosphere.
I'm with you.
And really, so innovators in Colombia and Africa, and we've had Nabil, who works with Debra, on from the Middle East as well. And just today, we've finished the judging of our inclusion challenge with the German Overseas Development Agency, where we were getting startups to pitch for a competition for inclusion in education in Africa. And what was really great was, yes, some of these technologies exist in the West, but not in the way that they're being deployed, and not in a culturally appropriate way either. Yeah. So they were working with DPOs and they were saying, well, yeah, okay, we can hear this stuff, but the text-to-speech voice isn't in my accent.
Right.
I don't like it. It doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
There were so, and then there were other solutions that had, were supporting the different local languages. Yeah. Those things are really important, and also, the fact that they're mobile first a lot of the time because they don't have a big infrastructure. So if you go to Africa, mobile money has been a thing in Africa for decades.
Yeah, M-Pesa, I think M-Pesa has been around for what, almost 15 years?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and here we're just sort of getting started. You go to China, right. Actually there's a big thing now because the government's restricting mobile payments because they realized that they couldn't control it enough but it was ubiquitous. So we really ought not to make those assumptions that we know everything. So I think that's something that we're super interested in. I'm really pleased to hear about the work that you've been doing. In terms of the advocacy work that your organization does, is it focused just inside the US at the moment, or do you have international disability advocates as well?
Well, at the moment, it is absolutely focused in the US. We have offices in Berkeley, California, and New York. We do cases in other parts of the country. And, our goal is to expand geographically. Now that we're in the Zoom world of the Zoom, it's possible. We have one lawyer in Chicago. And, it'd be interesting. I have not thought about expanding internationally. There are such great lawyers. I'm thinking of like Janet Lord and, Stephanie Ordaleva from Women Enabled International that are doing work. We actually have not talked about expanding, but, I think it's something to think about. Our work has made a big difference. The Disability Rights Advocates is 30 years old, and it started very soon after the ADA was passed, and the landscape was completely opened. A lot of the cases that they won have impacted millions of people with disabilities, including myself. Around accessible websites, around accessible paths of travel. Education, transportation, emergency preparedness, ride sharing. We have litigation is one tool in the toolkit. It is not, it is usually we try to reserve it as the end result. I prefer the art of structured negotiation, because I think when you work with a company and you negotiate a solution together, there's a lot less money spent on lawyers, and B, it's a mutually beneficial situation where there's more give and take rather than in a lawsuit. So DRA has worked with companies and is starting to do that more, do more what we call structured negotiation, so that there's a goodwill on both sides.
So we big fans of Lainey Feingold here. So
good, yeah. Well, Lainey's our girl.
So Lainey, the coiner of the term. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Volume 2 out now, by the way.
I've worked available with Lainey. I think she mentions me in her book, which I'm very proud to be mentioned, because I've worked with her for many, many years on a way to, work with companies, public entities, to come to a solution that's mutually beneficial.
Yeah, and I think that this is the aim for all of us that right. have been in the sphere for a long time. Is yes, litigation is sometimes necessary, but it's a tool of last resort. Correct. And we all want to default to collaboration as far as possible.
Indeed.
So I mean, for me, it's great to hear that you're doing this stuff. I'm very interested to see what will happen with international law, especially with the sort of some of these overarching regulations. What we're seeing at the moment is a trend on things like taxation, where there is international agreement that there will be at least a minimum level of taxation for international companies, for example, that I think would be really interesting to see how that might carry over into human rights legislation, and how we could then raise the floor globally for people with disabilities and minorities in general. So that was the thought behind my question. So I don't know whether that's something that might be considered. You've obviously got great connections globally, especially with the ILO, etc. Whether this would be maybe the next step.
It would be some, I have not worked with the ILO for quite a while. So, the people I work with, like Bob Ransom and, oh my gosh, I can't remember the woman's name. She's an Irish woman. I think they've since retired. I haven't worked so much with Stephen, although I used to work with Debra Perry. Anyway, enough name dropping. I think anything we can do to encourage global companies to see that whatever taxation may be, they may end up getting, to benefiting the overall workforce and the creativity and innovation and strategy. I mean, I see that niche as something that that we will have to develop expertise in quickly. Should corporations be taxed? And I think it's a long-term vision, and I would hope that corporations can see that this type of initiative could really raise all boats.
So I'm aware we've probably run out of time, but just that last thought before we thank our friends that keep us going was, I was on a conference yesterday and Carla Qualtrough was talking, and she's the Minister for Employment and also for Persons with Disabilities in Canada. And she said that actually if they made the accommodations for all of the disabled people in the workforce in Canada that were necessary to enable them to work, they would see a 2% increase in their GDP.
Absolutely.
So it's not asking for, it's an investment rather than a tax here. So this is generating economic opportunity. And on that note, I'll end it because we're out of time, and thank Barclays Access, Mike Link and My Clear Text for keeping us on air and captioned. Kathy, been a real pleasure talking with you, and I really look forward to you joining us on Twitter on Tuesday.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.